Hello, good evening, and welcome to the London Library for this evening's event, Agnes Poirier in conversation with Michael Goldfarb. We're delighted that you're here to join us for this fascinating topic, and we're very grateful to our event partners at the Bloomsbury Institute who, as you'll have seen already, have kindly included a copy of the book with the ticket, and will also be selling additional copies after the event. I'm amazed, very, very pleased to see that we have a sellout audience tonight. I'm really grateful for our members within the audience for supporting our events. This is the 10th event that we've done this year in a series that only started this year, and they've been extremely successful. I'm also delighted to note that nearly half of you are not members of the library, and I'm sure that means that some of you are experiencing the library for the first time. So welcome. And I hope for those people that this will be your first visit of many. Our membership is open to all, with the largest independent lending library in the world. We've got 1 million books and beautiful spaces like the one that you're in now to read and enjoy. The library supports readers and writers and is a fabulous resource for anyone who wants to use it. So please don't make this your only visit. Come back for a tour, come back to more of our events, sign up to our newsletter, and most importantly, tell your friends about us. We're particularly thrilled this evening to be hearing about the left bank and its inhabitants in the 1940s. I think that they would have found a home here at the library. We also have a community of creative types living and working and thinking and debating all in the same location in an atmosphere of intellect and inspiration. And indeed, the topics that are listed on the blurb of Agnes's book read like one of our collections guides. You've got literature, theatre, anthropology, philosophy, politics, cinema, art. We've got over 1 million books on these subjects, 2,000 subjects, in fact, in 55 different languages. So a very fitting place for this discussion to be happening. One of the other unique things about the London Library, as well as being the world's largest independent lending library, is the way that we have our books ordered on the shelves. They are alphabetically and by subject, and this makes for an amazing browsing experience. It means you can find what you want, but also what you didn't know that you want. It also makes for some very funny coincidences, and one of those came to mind when I was thinking about the people that we're going to hear about, those left bank inhabitants this evening. So in our science and miscellaneous section, because of the alphabetized subjects, you will find drink, drugs, and dueling all next to each other. I think they'd have liked that. So, thank you very much to our speakers for what's going to be a wonderful, wonderful evening. Firstly, Michael Goldfarb, who will be interviewing Agnes this evening. He's a journalist and broadcaster. He's covered conflict and conflict resolution on 5 continents and from 25 countries. His journalism has won him the highest honours on both sides of the Atlantic. He's also the author of 2 books and is known for his Radio 3 essays, his Radio 4 documentaries, and his podcast, First Rough Draft of History, fabulous title. He said about Agnes's book that if he had mastered French in high school, he might have lived in Paris. However, he didn't. He just glided through it, and so he's living it vicariously through the book. Agnes Poirier is Paris-born and London-educated. She's a journalist, a writer and critic and broadcaster. She's the author of 4 essays about the different ways in which France and Britain do things and view the world, a topic which I no doubt at the moment keeps her very busy when she appears in places like the BBC, Sky News and CNN, and writes, amongst other places, in The Guardian, The Observer, The Times and Marianne. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. What I think we'll do, we had a planning session while you were having a drink, is we'll talk amongst ourselves for half hour or so and then throw it open for questions. This isn't the first time I've interviewed Agnes about the book. Just after it was published, we did a session at a tiny French bookshop just off Brick Lane called Caravanserai. And then it was fresh reading experience, and I've had the pleasure of having to reread it for tonight. So the questions may be slightly different. And one thing that will help me in asking questions is, how many people have actually read the book already or had a look through it? Not very many. Oh, good. Okay, well then we know how to answer questions. Anyway, we'll talk for about half an hour, and then I know that you will have a lot of questions, and we'll try and save time so that everybody can ask a question, and Agnes can talk more about the book. I'd like to start by saying to Agnes, we'll always have Paris, and you'll always have Paris. That line was from Casablanca, which came out in 1943, when the subjects of this book were living under occupation in Paris. But Paris, you know, it really is a universal city. I know London's on the up at the moment, but it really is the universal city. And I'd like to start by asking you, how did you choose this decade? I mean, you could have chosen any number of times when I think most of the people in the room will know some of the lore of Paris. It could be the 1890s and the Belle Époque. It could be the 1830s, for God's sake, you know, in Victor Hugo time, or the 1920s, 1960s. But you chose 1940. How did that happen?
I didn't choose 1940. I chose originally 1944 to 1954. And so I researched that whole 10 years. And the first day when I started writing, I suddenly realized I can't start in 44.
Why couldn't you start in 44?
Because everything is, you know, everything starts 5 years earlier, really. Because all the people I talk about were shaped, and the people who they would become were informed by the experience of war, either in occupied Paris, either in London during the Blitz, or in the Peace of New York, you know, with their ears on the wireless, or of course in German prisoners, Germany's prisoners, war camps, or in concentration camps. So it was impossible. So anyway, so I had actually in my research covered almost 30 years. So I decided to start in 1940 or 1939.
Really 1939.
Or really
yeah.
1938,
Yeah.
actually. And because the publisher likes something neat, we stopped exactly 10 years later. But I've got half of the 50s already researched.
Right. Well, that'll be my last question about when the next volume comes out. But let's go back to the very beginning of the book. One of the main cast of characters, and it's a vast cast of characters, as you'll see when you read the book, you know, but it mostly centers on Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, people around them, and at the beginning of the war includes a philosopher who's fallen he's fallen off the front page, as it were, intellectually, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, but a very important figure in mid-century philosophy. And they all start at a certain point. And you, to research the book, started at a certain point. You actually went to Beauvoir's room.
Then I should set the...
You should read
yes.
this, because it's a beautiful passage.
So it's a little passage from the introduction. Paris being Paris, many places have not changed since the 1940s. And I tried to find those crime scenes as I thought of them, hoping to capture the atmosphere of the time and to lay my hands on the objects that had been touched by the ghosts I was stalking. Many of our protagonists lived in decrepit and cheap left-bank hotels. Those are still here today, but many have been transformed into luxury boutique lodgings. Except one, La Louisiane, family-owned since the time of Napoleon. Beauvoir lived there for 5 years, between 1943 and 1948, and so did Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Juliette Greco, and many others. There may be free Wi-Fi today, but the rooms at La Louisiane have not changed much since the 1940s. I booked myself in and slept between those evocative walls, reliving Beauvoir's words. So I quote from Beauvoir's diaries. Thursday, the 16th of May, 1946. Spring is coming. On my way to get cigarettes, I saw beautiful bunches of asparagus wrapped in red paper and lying on the vegetable stall. Work. I have rarely felt so much pleasure writing, especially in the afternoon, when I come back at 4:30 p.m. in this room still full of the morning smoke. On my desk, sheets of paper covered in green ink. The touch of my cigarette and pen at the tip of my fingers feels nice. I really understand Marcel Duchamp when asked whether he regretted having abandoned painting. He replied, "I miss the feeling of squeezing the paint tube and seeing the paint spilling onto the palette. I like that." So I never expected the past to assault, as it were, my every sense. I had expected a joust of ideas, endless intellectual disputes, but not for the past to materialize so clearly that I could touch it, smell it, even taste it. For me, writing this story has been rather like walking into a house on fire. The live fire of the war, the furnace of emotions, the passion of politics, the spectacular pullings out, the brutal sex, the nerve-wracking frustrations, the insane and beautiful ideals, the plotting of big schemes. So many failures and some remarkable achievements. The subjects of this book might have failed in the end to prevent the Cold War from becoming the New World Order. The deed, however, set up many standards by which we still live, almost 3/4 of a century later.
It's interesting, Agnes, when I say we'll always have Paris, the idea that you can go to La Louisiane, which is a hotel in the 6th arrondissement, and, you could ask to stay in de Beauvoir's room, and, it's not got a blue plaque on the door, does it? I mean, it's just a room, and Paris has managed to preserve to a certain degree. So writing history about the city of your birth in a decade, well, a couple of decades before your birth, but your parents were born, I think that must be a really interesting way of opening up your own life.
Well, the thing is, I've lived now half my life in Paris and London, and probably the most important part of my life in Paris, because this is where I was born and educated, but I was also partly educated in London. But you cannot, well, it's also true of Europe, but you cannot escape history in a city like Paris, especially in a way it hasn't changed much, and yet, it's a very lively capital city. And it just in the streets of Paris being so small and clearly defined with the peripheric around it, there's a physicality of history. That is to say, you can put your hands on the bullet holes, on the facade. La Commune, you can go to the Père Lachaise and and nothing has changed since the communals were all shut down, near that wall. And you can find the French Revolution. You see all these decades very clearly, and you can put your hands and feel it.
So you immersed yourself in this decade, and you start reading, and you tell this story. You have Sartre, who was captured in the Nazi Blitzkrieg West. He was actually captured and was a prisoner of war. Merleau-Ponty was captured. He was a prisoner of war. And they end up back in Paris. How did they get out?
Well, they tried. I mean, Henri Cartier-Bresson, the photographer, was also captured, in the first few weeks of the German invasion. And they tried to escape, and, Sartre was third time lucky. And the war completely changed him. Perhaps we should talk about, because, when the war breaks out, Sartre, Beauvoir, are philosophers and are philosophy teachers as well, and they couldn't care less about Well, politics. They are
They didn't
philosophers.
care at all.
Well, no. They cared about their students, and they cared about breaking social conventions and taking, which was never done. They're taking their students to cafes, and lending their jazz records and lending their books of American literature. But Sartre was 33, and no, for them, they lived in the realm of ideas, and philosophy was above, politics. So he escapes under false identity, and he sends a note to Beauvoir, who's resumed her teaching in occupied Paris, and she thinks it's going to be a very romantic reunion, and he says, meet me at the Café Les Trois Mousquetaires, I think it is. And all he wants to talk about is politics. And he says, well, we need to do something now. And he's so cross at her for having signed the affidavit that she is not a Jew. And he says...
What did she sign?
Well, she signed, as a teacher, she had to sign, or not. She could have chosen not to, because he never signed that letter saying to the administration that they were not Jews. But she did sign it. And she was also getting some food from the black market, and he was, entranced and really upset and angry, and they set up a resistance movement, which didn't last very long, because all they wanted to do was to fight with words, and we were in Nazi-occupied France.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, it's interesting because one of the things is we still have our myth about what the war was like here. And you can tell I'm American, but I've lived here for 33 years. And the war is always with us, and it's a time of heroism. And yet in France, in exactly that same period that London can take it and undergoing the Blitz, they're already occupied. And so I think that in understanding, one of the things that reading the book really brought home for me, you'd think you'd get it as second nature, but you need to be reminded, is that, such different war experience. In this city, it's a story of heroism and taking the worst. And over there, it is genuinely occupation and all of the psychological ramifications of being occupied. And all of the long-lasting trauma, I think, of the compromises. You were just talking about Beauvoir. Well, she's off shopping on the black market. She signed the piece of paper, said, I'm not a Jew. Well, I mean, perhaps in a more heroic sense, she would have said, I'm not signing anything. It's not your business whether I'm a Jew or not. But she had to do. People had to do to survive. And this is a fundamental difference, I think, that grows between the two countries.
So, what you're saying is absolutely fundamental to understand the occupation, Sartre wrote very well about it, but let me read a little passage. We're now in 1944. The first few months of 1944 were a time of frantic somnambulism. Everybody was going about their day like sleepwalkers, carrying their fate over their shoulder like a sling bag, toothbrush and soap in one's pocket just in case of an arrest. We all lived in transit between two rounds up, two hostage takings and two misunderstandings. This aspect of the occupation is essential to understanding the spirit of those years and how it marked and shaped the generations who lived through it. The concept of enemy is real and absolutely clear only when separated from us by a barrier of fire, as Sartre wrote. And this was mostly the experience of American and British soldiers. In Paris, there was also an enemy, one of the vilest nature, but it was faceless. It was not the German officer who offered his seat on the metro to women and elderly people. It was not the lost German soldier who politely asked his way. It was not the simple German soldiers who had become part of the furniture. Those who actually saw the face of that enemy rarely came back to tell the tale. Sartre compared this faceless enemy to an octopus, which would take away the country's best men and best women at night and make them disappear, as if guzzled up by an invisible monster. It seemed that every day around us, people were silently swallowed from beneath the earth. One day you would call a friend, and his phone would ring and ring and ring in the empty flat. You would knock at a door, but nobody would come to open it. If the concierge forced the door open, you would find 2 chairs, close together, in the entrance hall, with German cigarette butts scattered on the floor. Wives and mothers would seek some news at the Esday's torture chambers on the Avenue Hoche, where they would be courteously received. But at night, on that same avenue, screams of terror and pain would be heard from the cellar's air vents giving onto the pavements. Everybody in Paris had a friend or a relative who had been arrested, deported or killed. Yet nobody talked about it much. Out of dignity or caution, people would say they took him away. And he, just after the liberation of Paris, Sartre wrote, yes, that's right, in the autumn of 1944, he wrote a letter to his British friends, a short essay. I'll just a paragraph. Somebody who was asked what he had done during the terror in 1793 replied, "I lived." It is an answer we could all give today. The same daily and ordinary necessities made us all share the same space. We bumped into the German occupants everywhere, on the streets and in the metro, where we literally rubbed shoulders. Of course, we kept our resentment and our hatred for them intact, but those feelings had become somehow abstract. With time, an indescribable and shameful solidarity had emerged between Parisians and those foreign troops. A solidarity that wasn't in any way sympathy, but rather a biological habituation.
Biological habituation. That's a man who's thinking and trying to get down to the absolute essence of what others might judge him ill for. You know, the idea that over 2 years or 3 years, you just get used to these people. Not just because they have power over you, the power of life and death, but because they're just there. They're just there in the quotidian of life. But not everyone was just busy doing their philosophical work. In their circle, Camus was involved in the resistance. Merleau-Ponty kind of tried, but, never trust a philosopher to run your cell. That's the essence of what I took away from reading your book. But there were other extraordinarily brave people at the highest levels of culture, like Jaujard.
Oh, yes. So you want me to...
No, you don't have to read it. Just tell the story, because it's a good story.
So Jacques Jaujard, yes. But Jacques Jaujard had seen it all coming. The guy should have a statue in Paris. Nobody knows about him. He was I'm sure you do, but I didn't. He was the director of the Louvre Museum. And he had overseen, the good thing is he had done a sort of dress rehearsal on what was going to come. That is to say, during the Spanish Civil War, he had overseen the evacuation of the entire Prado collection to Switzerland. And he was convinced France would be invaded. So it was not a question of if, but of when. And he, even before the war was declared in September 1939, in the summer, we said, okay, well, we're going to close the Louvre Museum for 3 days, officially for repair. In fact, he had about 200 people, the staff of the Louvre Museum, but also art students, and also the people from the Samaritaine, which is a big store not very far, and all confidentially, they started putting all the arts in wooden case. And there was a code. There was a yellow dot for very important artworks. There was a green dot for world treasures. There was a red dot for world treasures. And one wooden case had 3 red dots. It was the Mona Lisa. And then he dispatched. They needed vehicles, everything he could lay his hands on. Taxis, ambulances, everything. And some couldn't be transported, some of them one Veronese, the wedding at Cana, could actually be rolled around a cylinder. But some others had to be in open trucks because that's the only way they could be, just with a blanket on top of them. And so that's how, a few days before the war was declared, it was dispatched in 20-odd chateaux, some of them Chambord, great chateaux, but he also requisitioned privately owned little inconspicuous chateaux lost in the French countryside. So basically, a year later, Count Metternich, the Nazi officer responsible for overseeing the arts in Europe, who came and knocked at his door at the Louvre Museum, Jaujard decided to be, straightforward, and he told Metternich, "It's all gone." So unlike Sartre, some people were preparing for the war. But yes, I think, as I say in the book, if only the French army had been as prepared as Jacques Jaujard.
Yes. Yeah, if only. But the war eventually ended. And what happened then, I think, was quite remarkable, because at that moment, all of this pent-up energy, it came out in a kind of instant renaissance. This idea that we had to reclaim our culture, our heritage, and also look forward to shape the future.
Well, we're talking about Sartre and Beauvoir a lot, and Camus, and we should perhaps extend. But anyway, there are 32 main characters in the book. It's
Shakespearean, isn't it? I know, the cast of characters is enormous, and at the front of the book, they're all listed.
Yeah, we should talk about...
before we get any further.
There's Norman Mailer, there's Saul Bellow, there's Miles Davis.
The Americans come later.
Yeah, but okay, so it's not a book about Sartre and Beauvoir and Camus, although their interaction is very important. No, it's interesting because, Sartre took a lot of flack after the war for not having been a great resistant. It's true that Albert Camus took risks, personal risks. He carried, weapons, and he had to hide at some point before the liberation of Paris. And at some point, the only heroic physical thing that Sartre ever did was he was sent by just as Paris was waiting for the French Second Division and the American and the Allies, and the resistance had started the insurrection, and they had to hold. Sartre was given the task by his resistance cell to guard with his life the National Theatre Company, the Comédie Française, and he was having a nap in the main theatre, and Camus arrived and said, "Oh, you're in the right sense of history or something." But having said that, Sartre was extremely active, and he set up he founded L'État Moderne, which is this review that still exists today. And it was until his death in July, run by Claude Lanzmann, who was then a very young collaborator of L'État Moderne. And when you read, I got to read 10 years of L'État Moderne. This is really where new journalism was born. It's said that new journalism was born 10 years later in New York. I have the feeling it really started then, because it's reportage, but it's literature. You read it like a thriller. It's a page turner, and yet it's about abortion, illegal abortion. It's about the looming troubles in Indochina, and they talk about things that weren't talked about at the time. And so it's called Modern Times. It's a tribute to Chaplin's a film, and they say at the very beginning, the first issue in October 1945, they say, we want to have an impact. We hold personally responsible Flaubert for not having stopped the Commune, for not having written about the Commune. And if you say it's not our duty to do something because we're philosophers and we are writers, then you're wrong. What was it Voltaire's duty to write about the Calas trial? Was it Émile Zola's duty to write about what was happening to Dreyfus? So, there's a whole manifesto, and they said we are going to engage with politics, and we intend to change politics.
What was life like in Paris after the war? Was it austerity as it was in London? Is that?
It was dreadful. It was not glamorous at all. We think about this period as being very glamorous.
Everybody was frozen.
I hope I'm debunking a few myths. This café society, I mean, why was the Café de Flore and Café des Deux Magots so, magnets? Just because they had a stove right in the middle. And that's why people flocked to it. And also because waiters were quite nice. You only had to pay for one, drink, and you could stay for 10 hours, and they wouldn't say anything, unlike today. So
and the heat of bodies, is that why the promiscuity, which Agnes, and I know you don't like to overemphasize that in these public conversations, but there's a lot of shagging going on. People are just, it doesn't matter. There seems to have been, the war seems to have bled jealousy out of Parisians completely. And it didn't matter who you slept with last night. There was no sense of possessiveness if they were warming your bed the next night.
Well, you're right. It's like the stove at the Café de Flore, I think. I mean, Simone de Beauvoir says that whenever she slept alone on those, didn't happen very often, but she wore her clothes, her mountain,
ski clothing,
yes. Well, we're talking about, I'm talking about Brassai and Picasso. Also, Brassai was this wonderful photographer who, during the occupation, Picasso asked him to come and take pictures of everything he had done during the war. And Brassai had lived alone in the 14th arrondissement with his best friend. His best friend was a goldfish, and the goldfish froze to death in his water tank. So, we're talking about freezing temperature. So you can partly, you're right, partly explain the promiscuity just by this simple fact.
Yeah.
But also there are other explanations, and I would also point to the fact that you've got people who could, during the occupation, you could just, be rounded up any moment. And it created, when I met Juliette Gréco, when I met Claude Lanzmann, I discovered larger-than-life people who were, who still lived as if death could catch up on them, and that's how they, she's still touring.
I know, it's extraordinary. Juliette Gréco, there's a wonderful picture in the book of Agnes sat on the sofa with Juliette Gréco, who still looks good in all black, I have to say. And how old is she? She must be...
She's 90.
She's 90.
And it took me a year to see her because she was too busy. Mrs. Gréco is too busy to see you. She was not intending on dying anytime soon. She's still alive. Wonderful. And she was touring. She was recording her album. Call back in a year. She might have half an hour for you. And Claude Lanzmann was like this until he died, in July, and he was 93. Those people couldn't imagine life without work as well, because we're talking about workaholics. We're talking about people who lived life so much to the fore and worked so hard. We're talking about this promiscuity, but they were workaholics.
Yeah, that's the other thing is that they put out stupendous amounts of writing, as if unchained from the threat of death.
Well, there's also...
And also there was methamphetamines,
yes.
But that's a different part of the story as well. But they do put out thousands and thousands of words a day. Yeah. Right, we're in the London Library. I occasionally can do 2,000. publishable words of journalism when
That's
I'm being
good.
paid enough. But you know, these were people who were doing this every day, and they were in the cafes, and they were making love at night. It's really quite extraordinary. Now, I want to get to the audience, but we've only got basically the book neatly slots across the decade into three bits.
And we haven't talked about art.
And we haven't talked about art or the Americans. Are they related? No. We can talk about art. Let's talk about art. We can talk about the Americans another time. Go ahead.
Well, the Americans are pretty funny. I mean, Saul Bellow hated Paris. What a contrarian man. He came on a scholarship, Guggenheim scholarship in '48. He had just written two essays, sold 2,000 copies at most, and he was trying to find his voice. He found it in Paris. He admitted it later. But what he did, I discovered by crossing information, because, I mean, all this, we didn't talk of the fact that all these people have had, dozens of biographies, and every single one of them. But what I wanted to do was to join the dots, because they all knew each other, influenced each other, and that's really what the book is about. You wouldn't put in the same room Giacometti and Sartre and Calder, and yet, Calder, the American sculptor, and Giacometti wanted Sartre to write their catalogues, because they felt that only him understood their work. And it's true. I've never read anything so brilliant on Giacometti than what Sartre wrote, for instance. You wouldn't put Gene Kelly and Sartre in the same room. You should. So Saul Bellow is this fantastic character, because he comes to Paris, he puts his family on the right bank. He has a room on the left bank, to write, of course, but not only. And it's very difficult. And suddenly it's by... and he keeps at it, because he's serious and disciplined. And he writes something and it's not good. And indeed, it's really not very good. And then he has an epiphany just by one morning in the streets of Rue de Seine, I think it is. He sees the strip sweepers who, let, in the morning, they've got a wrench and they let the water out, gushing out on the pavement. And he has an epiphany. He goes back to his little study, a room in a hotel, and he starts writing The Adventures of Augie March. This is when it started, 48. The same happens to James Baldwin, and I talk about it, and Richard Wright, and Norman Mailer, who became a Trotskyite, for better or worse, in Paris. And of course, there's Picasso as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, because what are the first words of Augie March? I mean, we've all seen it. They flush out the drains in Paris, and you see, some guy with some witch on a broomstick style broom shuffling the rubbish down towards the sewer entryway. And the first line of Augie March is, "I'm an American, Chicago born." So somehow, this is an extraordinary epiphany, actually. Here's a guy in Paris with, on some fellowship or whatever, and he sees the most Parisian scene imaginable.
And that brings him back to Chicago.
And it makes him write that.
But then he explained it later, because when in Chicago, he read so much Balzac and Zola, and so he was full of Paris in Chicago, and so it took time. But after a few months in Paris, he reclaimed Chicago, and also I think. Until then, because he was always afraid, he was aggressive, passive-aggressive, because he was afraid of not being recognized, not being appreciated. And so I discovered by crossing information that he was actually going to spy on Sartre and Beauvoir and Koestler just to get a glimpse of them. He would position himself in the cafe opposite, the Café Royal, and pretending all the way that, those promiscuous French intellectuals, I don't want to have anything to do with them. But he shared a few mistresses with some of them, and he approached them. And then he would write back to his friends in derogatory terms, but he would just go and spy on them. Yeah. Saul Bellow.
Yeah, Saul Bellow. There's a pathologist.
I love him though.
Yeah,
but,
it's a real pathologist. This is not a prop. This was just behind me, and I noticed that is Saul Bellow, and he is. I know he's a difficult fellow to deal with, but it is interesting how many of the people who came over to the City of Art, but they were people who wouldn't have survived in the 1920s. They were trying to revive that movable feast of Ernest Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald of the 20s, I think, but they were all Jewish or African American, which I find quite remarkable. You don't find the same kinds of people who made Paris famous in the 1920s. Anyway, but look, we could go through the whole book. You should go through the whole book and enjoy it. But before you do that, let's have some questions. Yes, sir. Do we have a microphone? I think we have a microphone.
I've got the microphone.
Oh, yes, but you have to actually answer the question.
We've now got one microphone.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I must say I'm very much looking forward to reading this book. When I was young, many years ago, I read Albert Camus' book, L'Homme Révolté, as the rebel, and completely changed the direction of my life. And I went off to LSE instead of going to do chemistry at King's or something like that. So I'm really pleased to be able to read this book. I wanted to ask you about a character in your list of characters, Arthur Koestler, who wrote some remarkable books on both politics and also in the history of science. But he seems to have sort of dropped out of view. Why do you think that's happened to him, but not some of the other figures like Sartre and Camus and de Beauvoir and some of the other literary figures?
I think for two reasons. You can talk about the other reason.
No, you answer the question, because...
No, for two reasons. He was a lion of literature. He deserves, his writings deserve to be read again, I think. The Scum of the Earth, for instance, is remarkable. His time when he was interned in a camp in France, because he was throwing out in a bit like Stefan Zweig when he was in Britain at the beginning of the war. And Darkness at Noon was a phenomenal success, and it is considered in France as having tilted the referendum on the Fourth Republic Constitution in spring '46 against the communists, who had cooked up that constitution. He was a formidable, because of his experience, Hungarian, wrote in German and then in English and then settled in England, but also partly in France. He was a formidable public intellectual, never considered that seriously, perhaps because of his thick accent in Britain. And then, and I talk about it in the book, he was a pretty dreadful individual as a partner, as a husband. He was a wife beater. And he has a very sulfurous, as we would say, sulfureux, as we would say in French, a bad reputation. And that's the reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in this day and age, I can remember when the first biographies came out that detailed his wife beating 30 years ago. It really did begin, it pummeled what was left of his reputation. He got caught in the crossfire of
rape allegations.
He had been on the left, but became very anti-communist. So you lose. I mean, in the book, Agnes is very good about, these currents of, we think of the left, right? But very quickly in the late 40s, the French Communist Party, under orders from Moscow, kind of disavowed a great number of these intellectuals and artists who were essentially sympathetic to, I suppose, a communist worldview, but not a party worldview, certainly not a Stalinist worldview. And so they get disowned. And that caught him out as well. He was... And
also, because the book also, we didn't talk about the third way, which is quite important, because Sartre, Camus, Koestler, Beauvoir, Richard Wright, really for years tried to invent, a third way, the middle way, whatever.
And they called it the third way.
Yes, they called it the third way. That is to
before
say,
Tony Blair cooked it up, yeah.
but it had started before. Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, wrote a book called The Middle Way, I think in '38, and it wasn't a new idea. I think it emerged in the '20s, but Jean-Paul Sartre founded a political party called Rassemblement Démocratique Révolutionnaire. It's the idea of a revolutionary center in a country so polarized as France. And he financed it, and there was, thousands of people who became members. And, 18 months later, they had to disband it because at some point, they couldn't hold the fort between between the Soviet Union and the American way of life and the American model. They tried very hard, but Koestler sided with American politics and America, Pax Americana, and Sartre and Beauvoir eventually became fellow travelers of the Communist Party. They couldn't invent, they couldn't create that third, a sort of humanist socialism, social justice and individual freedom. And Camus had the luck of dying young. He didn't make the mistakes that Sartre and Beauvoir made, and he didn't become a sort of conservative like Koestler. Yeah. And what they wanted to create was a kind of social democracy. But there's one thing, and I end the book with this, is in the manifesto of Sartre's party was, we need an independent Europe from the Soviet Union and from America. And I end the book with, the beginning of the European Union.
It's interesting. Another question, anywhere. Yes, this gentleman here.
Thank you. Can I ask you a question about the first part of the book, cultural relations between the occupying forces and French intellectuals? I mean, Edith Piaf, I think, made a trip to Germany, and she talked to, or sang rather, to prisoners of war. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
I don't know about that particular trip of Edith Piaf. I can tell you about some. I found out about this extraordinary German officer called Gerhard Heller, who arrived in Paris on his 31st birthday, and he was very young. And Otto Abetz, the German ambassador in Paris, gave him the literary industry to oversee. And for him, it was the best time of his life. He had studied in Italy, he had studied in France, he loved literature. And he actually such an ambiguous time, he struck a deal with French publishers, saying, and especially, for instance, with Gallimard, which is the biggest publishing house, which didn't choose to close down, because you could say that the only moral option was to close down. But Gallimard was too big, perhaps, to close down, and they had a house fascist. They appointed a house fascist, a very good writer, but still fascist, called Drieux-La Rochelle, had a tiny office, and next to him was the in-house resistant, Jean Paulhan, and who was running his little resistance cell right next to Drieux-La Rochelle, and they knew of each other's activities. Nobody denounced the other. They had a common love, which was literature. What a strange thing. Very Parisian, very, this is the occupation. And Gerhard Heller, for instance, got to read every single book and to give his approbation or not. And also he had to supply the paper. So if he didn't supply paper, there was no book. He read The Outsider, during a night. He loved it. And he talked to Gallimard, Gaston Gallimard. He said, "Okay, I'll cover your back. It's too good a book." And this guy had a double life, a very dodgy double life. At night, he would take off his Nazi uniform and roam the streets of of Paris, looking for young people of both sexes. And there's Ernst Jünger, this great German writer, who was doing some awful things while, having lunch with Jean Cocteau, a nice thing, but his task was to translate the letters of French resistance to their family before they got killed or assassinated. And he could then he would do his work, and then he would go and buy ancient books. So that's, and we can talk about Sacha Guitry. There's a great scene in the book, and I think it's Cartier-Bresson. Well, during the few days of the liberation of Paris, they sent some very young, pugnacious French resistance to Sacha Guitry's house, saying, taking him in his pajamas to be interrogated by the French resistance because he had been deemed a collaborateur. And they asked him, why did you have lunch with Goering when he came to Paris? And Sacha Guitry said, I thought it would be interesting. Well, obviously, that was not the right answer. And we could talk about Arletty, who was under house arrest. She was the biggest French star. She was under house arrest for a few months. And she had a very famous relationship, liaison with the German officer. And when asked about it by young French resistance, she said, well, my heart belongs to Paris. No, my heart belongs to France, but my arse is international.
Cool. We probably have time for two more, so let's get your hands up. One, that woman over there, and this woman over here.
You talked about Arletty. I was so pleased in the book that you did nearly a page on Les Enfants du Paradis, Pierre Brasseur, and particularly Jean-Louis Barrault, because that film is usually called the best film ever made, and it has these sort of moral things in it. It's just the most incredible film. I fell in love with the whole film when I was 17, and I've never thought that any better film was made. But you just gave Arletty a lot, but you also talked about Jean-Louis Barrault.
Well, it's also, that the film was shot by Marcel Carnet in occupied France. And Marcel Carnet got a lot of flack too for having continued to work and not having fled to Hollywood like other French stars. But was it more courageous to go to Hollywood and have nothing to do, of course, with Nazi Germany in France, or to stay? I don't have the answer. And in his team, there were a lot of extras. If you know the film, there are hundreds and hundreds of extras. And the funny thing is, a lot of the extras were resistance. In disguise. They were, playing, being extras during the day, and there were also a lot of collaborateurs because the French studios had to use the people from the Vichy where they were because they shot in the south of France, and the music composer. And the art director were Jews, and so they used pseudonym. So when you look at the credits, it's not their real names. And if it had been known from the authorities that Troner and Koestler were working on the film, well, it could have ended very badly. So, it's I guess it encapsulates the ambiguity of the time.
Yeah, the ambiguity. What's interesting is there is this theme that the German, Paris was lucky, I suppose, in that a critical number of the German censors and overseers of who could or who could not work were cultured men and turned a blind eye to the stupidity of official anti-Semitism and so on. And that was a bit of luck, simply. It was simply a bit of luck.
And also during the liberation of Paris, I can't remember, it's in the book, but all the landmarks, or every single bridge in Paris, had they were ready to be blown up, and of course the Eiffel Tower and a few others, and it was decided not.
The order was never given.
No.
Yeah. One last question over here.
You didn't really talk about the occupation.
Didn't I?
I haven't read your book, but you didn't discuss the occupation. The emphasis was not on the occupation. It was about individuals and how they reacted to the circumstances. But the occupation fascinates me, and how they performed within the occupation. And Sartre and Cocteau, their plays were performed during the occupation. They were not.
Yes, they were performed, but if in '44.
Before you say, were you
sorry.
able to hear that at the back? Okay. The gentleman was asking about this level of normality that plays by Sartre and Cocteau were performed during the occupation.
And Camus as well, yeah. No, you're right. And actually, the characters are leading the story. That's why, you go, it's a round of characters and trying to give a personal idea of the bigger scheme, like the occupation. But to go back on the play, I think the Les Mouches, I can't remember now. But anyway, the play by Sartre that was performed before the liberation of Paris. Well, it's the same. Gerhard Heller still authorized it, and you can really, when you read the play, when you see the play, it's a call to arms, a call to insurrection. And Gerhard Heller told the Gestapo, his colleagues in the other office, said, no, it's nothing to do with that. It's you haven't understood anything. So, each time Heller would intervene, not each time, but very often, when he liked something, and said, and so he saved the beef of so many. So that's why some very important work were actually published at the same time as, fascist pamphlets. So there was a front and there was a smokescreen, and there were Francophile German officers, and it's difficult to.
Like the Corbeau, the film, which was accepted at the time, but now it's considered, to be reactionary and extreme.
Well, it depends. It's a story of denunciation, and actually, Children of Paradise. It's the story of, so it's set. A lot of those plays or movies were set, in a bygone, like Les Visiteurs du Soir. Another time, it was easier. And Antigone as well. Children of Paradise, Arletty, was seen as the embodiment of France. Four men are circling around her, are in love with her, and she gives herself quite freely to them, except she only loves one. Every play was interpreted whether, you were resistance or not, but and of course after the myth. We can talk about just after the war. All those plays were resistance. But there is a reading, there are different readings. Hence the ambiguity.
Yeah.
I look forward to reading your book.
Okay.
I hope there is enough occupation for you.
Yeah. We're going to stop now because, one, it's 8 o'clock and I was told to stop at 8 o'clock. Two, because Agnes is going to sign books. They're all at the back. And I just want to say that the pleasure of reading it a second time in this moment is, to see how people respond to being in extreme political situations, and to match up the responses, some courageous directly, some indirectly courageous. It does have a resonance for today. It's all, you think, the 1940s, it does have a genuine resonance. And the only thing that I'm really curious about, since you started by saying you actually wanted to end the book in 1954, is has Bloomsbury given you an advance to do the 1950s?
No, I think no.
No?
Absolutely not.
Bloomsbury representatives are here, I believe.
No, I think it would be actually a mistake to write a follow-up, to write the 50s.
60s?
So, no, I think I'm going to do a prequel.
Oh, which decade?
Well, I can't.
Yes, you can. Come on. We're all very discreet. We're like a resistance cell. We can all keep a secret.
And it's not filmed nor recorded. Well,
Okay.
they will be, it's before the First World War.
Okay. Very good. So any time from what?
Well, you can call it the Belle Époque if you'd like.
Oh, I could say that. I was going to go back to when the Kingdom of France was unified, sometime in the Middle Ages. But that's okay. And Paris became the true capital of all the French. Anyway, Agnes, thank you so much for the book. Thank you for
Thank you.
for this
Thank you all
interview.
for coming.
And thank you.